Whoa, buddy. Put that thing back in its holster. We haven't gone anywhere.
I don't understand.
Check out the MichaelDukesShow.com for information on how to get access to the podcast.
Welcome to the party, pal.
The Michael Dukes Show.
The greed and the entitlement is astounding to me.
What more could you want from a low-budget radio program?
This is a dumpster fire.
That was just BS.
It is time to get a new perspective.
We know just what you need, and we've got just the cure. Open wide and prepare for a steaming hot cup of freedom.
I just don't fathom it.
The Michael Dukes Show, streaming live across the world.
Oh, live across the world on the internet at MichaelDukesShow.com and across the state of Alaska on this, your favorite radio station and or translator. Good morning and welcome to the program. This is the winter that will never, ever, ever end. I mean, seriously, right? I mean, you got more snow over the weekend here in the Mat-Su. I know there's supposed to be more snow in Fairbanks, probably more snow down on the peninsula, and still cold. And I'm ready. I'm just ready for another oof. Just ready for some green stuff, a little warmth, a little nice feel good stuff. This is the winter of our discontent, unfortunately. And here we are, ready to go. But we'll make it through. We'll make it through. I have faith in you. I have faith in you that you're going to help make it through here this morning. Monday morning, and we are ready to go. A bit of an interesting show lined up for you today. Here in hour one, we're going to continue our discussions on education this morning with our guest, Sarah Montalbano, who is the education policy analyst for the Alaska Policy Forum. She's going to be joining us this morning to talk more about what's going on in the education world. We'll talk about that $175 million increase outside the BSA. And also, we're going to talk a little bit about COVID funds because there's been lots of discussion about how, well, it's a crisis, right? I mean, it's a crisis at every level. That's what they say. It's it's gonna fail again. That seems to be an ongoing bit with many school districts, that if they don't get the help that they're requesting, that this is going to be a disastrous year, or next year will be a disastrous year, or it's going to be bad. No matter what's going on. And unfortunately, I guess fortunately, it doesn't always seem to be the case. But we've been hearing some rumblings about, well, what about all the monies from COVID that have been going around? Millions of dollars still sitting in accounts for various schools around the state. Some have zero. I understand Fairbanks has expended all of their funds, but there are others that still have tens of millions of dollars in the bank. And the question is, why aren't we using that? If there are fiscal holes that we need to plug, why aren't we using that instead of coming back in a state that is currently in a fiscal crisis? So, I mean, that's going to be part of our discussions this morning with Sarah Montalbano. It's going to be a good discussion. Always enjoy talking to Sarah. Then in hour two, I thought we would change it up just a little bit. I quite honestly have been thinking about this, trying to get this put together for a while. We're going to be talking with author James Bartlett about his book called The Alaskan Blonde. And this is a true crime story that took place almost 70 years ago in Fairbanks. And it's a scandal that, I mean, it hit everything from Newsweek to Life to pulp detective magazines and everything else. James Bartlett, who's a journalist, has been working on the story for several years and has uncovered a lot of new evidence, including some memoirs and re-examining the FBI files and everything else. It's a true crime story from Alaska, and I thought that this. I think this is it's going to be a fun story. It's going to be a fun discussion, especially looking back at the life of my old hometown there. So he's going to be joining us in hour 2, and we'll talk with him about it, and we'll see what comes of that. So should be an interesting discussion with James Bartlett. And it's I don't know, it's something different, right? I'm looking for that, something a little bit different than just the standard political fare that we seem to be locked into as of late. So, all right. So what else we got going on? Stories. We got the stories. Speaking of education and all the school districts, doom and gloom kind of thing, maybe, just maybe, one city in the state gets it. I don't know, maybe, possibly. Must Read Alaska is reporting that the Kenai City Council voted on a resolution that would have supported an increase in the funding formula for school districts around the state, but they voted it down. Resolution was offered by Council Member Henry Knackstead in response to an estimated $13 million budget deficit for the coming year. The legislature, obviously unlikely to pass an increase in the formula, the BSA, because, the state's broke too. Instead, the House is proposing that one-time allocation, the $175 million that we've talked about, that would be outside the BSA, and adding more monies to schools without committing itself in the future to a formula that it might not be able to afford. That's why it's one-time funding. The Soldotna City Council and the Kenai Peninsula Borough have both passed resolutions in support of a higher amount of the formula spending. But after a spirited debate in which the opponents of the resolution pointed out that every year there are dire predictions of funding shortfalls, and that the BSA increase comes with no accountability. I mean, they spend it, but what do you get for the increase in spending? Are we going to get better results? There's nothing tied to it. The majority of the council in the long run voted to postpone the item indefinitely, which I think is an interesting. I think that's interesting. It's an interesting take on what's going on there. So good for them. But I think the most important things here is understanding that every year there are dire predictions of funding shortfalls. We've heard that for years, that if we don't get our fair share from the state, if we don't get in a little extra kiss, if we don't get some extra kick, that the schools are going to, I don't know. The implication is always that there'll be some kind of meltdown in the city or in the school districts in these cases for that to go on. So I guess my hat's off to the Kenai City Council for deciding to try and do what they can do. But didn't stop Soldotna or the KPB from resolving to ask for more money. But, there you go. There you go. All right. Well, after the big discussion that we had last week about the Wednesday walkout of the House minority, we really had no idea what was going to be happening. We had talked with Representative Kevin McCabe, and he described the actions of the day and kind of the bizarro world that we were living in and what was happening. And he wasn't sure what was going to take place the next morning, although Kathy Tilton had called a recess to basically give everybody a chance to cool off. And that apparently worked. The Alaska Beacon reported that on Thursday, the attitude in the House of Representatives was 180 degrees opposite from what it was on Wednesday. Afterward, the House Minority Leader Calvin Schrage pledged a reset would take place on Thursday morning, and the prediction, according to James Brooks, said that that held true, even as lawmakers continued to hold to separate positions. They want to move past it, and it looks like they may actually have a vote on the final draft version of the Alaska State operating budget as early as sometime this morning. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all over. The good news, I guess, we could say, is that the funding mechanism for the $175 million in temporary funding increase for the public schools is still contingent upon that successful vote to spend money from the CBR. It's a minor piece of good news because it still means that they are sweeping money back out of the CBR and, basically playing that game of whack-a-mole that they have done every year for the last, I don't know how many years, with the sweep and the reverse sweep coming back in. The budget still contains a deficit that approaches about $600 million for the coming year. So still in the hole. And we're still in the hole for this year for about $400 million, 300 and something million on top of it. So almost $1 billion by the time it's all said and done for this year, current year that we're ending in right now, because we got May and June, and that's it. So April, May, June, last 3 months of the year, still got a major deficit there and still have $600 million in next fiscal year. But this isn't the last word. The House could vote the budget out and send it over to the Senate, but the Senate could take a completely another tack. They've yet to unveil their proposal for the operating budget. And once they do and get it passed, and it seems like they're obviously a little more, they're a little bit more in line with the House minority instead of the majority. But once they unveil their plan and they sit down, it'll go to what they call the conference committee. And then various members of the Senate and the House will duke it out and figure it out on this conference committee and come up with a finalized combined bill. One of the things that I heard this weekend is that, and it is actually tweeted by the Alaska Landmine. It says, here's what Rep. Edgmond, who is in the majority, he's one of the independent members who's he's played all sides of the fence over the years. But it says, here's what Rep. Edgmond seems to be orchestrating with his Senate counterparts. The House sends the budget to the Senate. They hold it and other appropriations bills until the very end. The Senate sends back a bill stuffed with operating capital and supplement budgets. It will have a $200 million increase in education funding, a $1,700 dividend, a $300 million capital budget, and most importantly, not require a CBR draw. So this is what that seems to be the analysis from Jeff Landfield at the Landmine. We'll see if that actually plays out that way. But it's not unheard of to use time compression as a weapon, where they hold on to it to the very last minute and then force it down to say, well, if you don't vote for this, then we shut the government down because we just have no more time. Even though we've spun our wheels for weeks, we'll have to see what happens. But if the minority or if the majority in the House gets the budget out pretty quick here, that leaves a lot of time for the Senate. They'll have to burn a lot of daylight. We'll see what happens, though. We'll be watching that and talking about that as we go along. All right, well, here we are. We are up against it. We got more coming up. And Sarah Montalbano I just like saying that, is our guest. She's going to be joining us here in just a minute. I see she's in the green room. Her happy smiling face is all ready to go, and we're going to talk edumacation. That's not a real word, but I made it up and it sounds good. So we're going to use that one here in a minute. Education with Sarah Montalbano from the Alaska Policy Forum. We will continue in just a moment. Don't go anywhere. The Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio.
Running on 100% pure beard power. Oh, also some coffee. We dip our beard in coffee.
Ha, nice beard.
The Michael Duke Show.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Oh, man. What you guys got here this morning? Anything good? Let me see. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. It's a lot of good mornings. Seeing some nobody. No, don't kick the dog. Not a good idea. I hope the Kenai doesn't give up. Yeah, me too. Schools need to be pressured into administrative reform. I couldn't agree more. The schools have no business getting into the CBR, says Jeannie. The schools wouldn't be getting into the CBR. It's not how it, but don't we all keep savings for an emergency? Isn't every school district telling us that they are in an emergency situation? Yeah, that's right, Kevin. That's what I was saying. Just millions and millions of dollars. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, Donnie. Donna. Donnie. Good morning, Donnie. Good morning, Donna, in DC. Good to see you. Thanks for coming in. How is the weather? Is it lunchtime yet? No. Although I'm a little hungry. I could eat. I could definitely eat something. I don't know what. I look like the big boy. I got that little thing going on today that I don't know what it is, but I look like the statue of that big boy. Give me a big burger, hold it out there, and that's what I look like. The weekend was way too short. Let me just put that out there. Let me just throw that out there for you for nothing. Way too short. But luckily, my guest never sleeps. She never sleeps. She works all weekend. She doesn't do anything else. And I'm lucky for me because she agreed to come on the program and talk with us. And here she is, the one, the only Sarah Montalbano from there we go. Alaska Policy Forum. Hello there, young lady. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, and I actually had some chance to relax this weekend.
Did
so
you really?
Did not work the whole time.
That's great. That's great. I watched way too much television this weekend.
Me too.
I got onto a kick, and the next thing I know, I had consumed every episode of Star Trek: Strange Worlds, the new old prequel, whatever. I was like, oh, I'll watch this, and I was like, wow, that was how many episodes was that? Got to go to bed. So anyway, it was just one of those things where you just kind of turn your mind to idle and just kind of you need that recharge a little bit sometimes, where I'm not thinking about all the pains of the world. All right, so we're ready to dive into this and talk a little bit about this. We've got the $175 million one-time increase coming. Well, for right now, it could be more, could be 200 million, could be, who knows what they're going to dream up in the long run. But I had to laugh. I don't know if you were listening to the program here a few minutes ago talking about the Kenai City Council voting against this. They voted against a resolution to ask for more funding. And they cited two of the reasons that they said. Opponents pointed out that every year there are dire predictions of funding shortfalls. So the sky is falling every year. Oh, it's going to be bad. And that the BSA increase comes with no accountability. And so they voted to postpone this resolution indefinitely. They basically killed it. And I thought that was kind of interesting because I remember being on the assembly and hearing similar things. This is like 9 years ago when I was on the borough assembly in Fairbanks. That, if we don't get that state funding, it's going to collapse in on itself. And And of course, this is after we discovered that they had some emergency funds and things. We made them create a building maintenance facility fund because we got hundreds of millions of dollars in unfunded deferred maintenance. And I'm like, but you're sitting on all these accounts. Why aren't we? So anyway, it should be a real good discussion for today, and I'm looking forward to it. So anyway, I hope you had a great weekend.
I did, yeah.
Good. Anything good? What were you watching? I'm just curious.
Oh, mostly early seasons of King of the Hill, would you believe it? I haven't watched that much, so.
Dang it, Bobby. Dang it.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll tell you what.
I tell you what. Giddy. My kids watch that, and they quoting it to each other all the time. Anyway, all right, here we go. We're jumping back into it. The Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. Like and share, like and follow. Subscribe on YouTube. Do all the stuff that we're supposed to do. Let's get jiggy with it. I mean, that's not a real thing, but... Okay, welcome back to the program. It is the Michael Duke Show. It's Monday morning. Everybody's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, right? We're ready to go and sit down and talk about some serious stuff. Education is in the mix, and bringing us up to speed on this is one of our favorite people talking about education, and that is Sarah Montalbano, who is the education policy analyst for the Alaska Policy Forum. That's a mouthful. We should just call her the education chick. I mean, that would be better. Although, is that sexist? I don't even know anymore. Anyway, Sarah Montalbano joins us this morning to talk education. Hello, my friend. How are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. How about yourself?
There's no complaints. So I asked you to come on the program to talk a little bit about a couple different things. Number one, I wanted to talk about this $175 million one-time piece of funding. Some of the mechanics of it, what does it mean that it's not part of the formula and it's outside and everything, but also about the accountability aspect, which I know you and I have talked about in the past before, because that seems to be something that's severely missing from a lot of the things that we talk about. And then the second thing I want to talk about is this, where's the money? What I mean by that is we got a lot of COVID funds in the state, hundreds of millions of dollars in COVID funds, and a lot of it went specifically to the schools because, well, the schools were all shut down, right? And they needed to do things like remote learning and all these other kind of stuff. And so there were millions and millions and millions of dollars that were pumped in there. And now I'm hearing about school districts that are sitting on pretty good sized reserves of money from COVID. Some apparently have spent it all. Some have not. Some are still sitting on quite a golden goose egg. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that as well. But let's get started on the increase. So $175 million, which I find it interesting that they break it down as a dollar figure. They say, well, it's a $600 and something per BSA increase, but it's not inside the BSA, right? I mean, this is outside of the base student allocation. This is a one-time funding because they don't want to be committed to it for the future. Am I, break this out for us here a little bit here. Give us your thoughts on it as you look at it.
That seems to be my understanding of it. I must be honest, I am not completely up to date on the news about this, but I did see that the $175 million had passed through and is being discussed. One-time funding makes a lot of sense in some areas. When we break it down into a per student BSA, we have to remember that all of these figures are fungible. So some student might get $0 of benefit and the others might get more. That's just an average figure. So that is the only thing I would really note about this. Is that this is, a large sum of money, but it makes us have this conversation again next year, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on how you think about it. But it does make us have these conversations, and it requires us to think about fiscal sustainability again, instead of, because we've done these one-time increases before, that, all of these different things. I think last time I was on your program, we discussed all of the things that pile on top of the formula, and those are significant and shouldn't be ignored. So if this is one way to think about this increase in funding, then this is perhaps something to consider.
Well, I mean, because again, that's part of the problem, is that we're already looking at it's not just, although many Alaskans probably who aren't as well versed in what's happening will read the newspaper and go, oh, of course we need to fund education, that this must be, in their mind, the BSA must be the only funding that the kids are getting, instead of it's just a factor, and it's not just a per pupil. There's also multipliers. There's also this. There's also that. I keep going back to the whole Anchorage School District getting funding for 70,000 plus kids when they only have 44,000 kind of thing. But the bottom line here is that this is one time, because they can't decide on a new formula. They haven't been able to bring it out, even though many people have said this is what we need to do. We need to break down the formulas and take a look at them. We need to see where the money's going inside the formula. Is it going into the classroom, or is it going towards administrative and overhead costs? And what is the overall per pupil cost in the long run? And you've had a lot of articles out recently talking about all of those different factors, showing that just because you give $1 to education doesn't mean that it actually is going to the ultimate in-classroom teaching of the student.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things we discussed last time as well. There are these multipliers to the formula that increase the BSA. There are so many things on top of the school funding formula as well. And what we have seen is that increases in funding historically have not improved outcomes. Since 2003, we've lost almost a year on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. We need to think about the way these incentives are lining up in the school funding formula. Are they incentivizing teachers to do the best work that helps students in the classroom? And, having this conversation this year, next year, it can be a long process, but it's one worth having.
And of course, one of the things that we saw is this became a major campaign issue in this last go around, is that the school funding, we could see the handwriting on the wall, was going to be one of the things that was just, ultimately important. And we were talking about increases in the $1,300 per student range for the BSA. This does not hit into that. This is only about 600 and change along the lines, but it's still a significant amount of money. And again, there is no linkage with the assessment or the outcome of the students. And as you point out, our scholastic achievement continues to decline, even though, we spend we are one of the highest states, right, on a per student spend for that.
Yes, we are. And the census puts us in 2020 at $18,313 per student. I've cited that a lot, you can probably tell. But that is before, COVID relief funds and things like that. And I know we'll be talking about that too, but that is also millions of dollars that districts are sitting on and may not be using wisely.
And, accordingly, you would think that more money equals better outcomes.
But that is the assumption.
That's not only the assumption, that is the battle cry from those who are advocating for more education spending. If only we had more money, we could do better. But at the same time, not including any kind of, like I said, linkage between achievement, scholastic achievement, and the thing is I think is a huge mistake. Now, other states have started to do that. They have started to put those. They've started to put that linkage in to say you receive, X amount until you hit certain milestones, and then you receive more. And that is some of the newer things that we're seeing across the country. This is not uniquely an Alaskan issue, I think, but we're starting to see this across the country now.
Yes, we are. And one of the things I like, Tennessee has a particularly interesting school funding formula. And what they've done is they've created an outcomes-based bonus to these formulas. So you get a certain amount per student that is proficient in third grade English language arts, things like that are, really crucial for later grades. 8th grade math, you're going into high school math, calculus, things like that. Are you prepared? So they are able to incentivize outcomes without penalizing any districts that have poor outcomes, because you can imagine if you're taking away funding from schools that aren't doing well, that's obviously not a good thing. But having that financial incentive really does make districts perform better, and they've seen good results from that. Florida as well incentivizes passing scores on the advanced placement AP exams, and they have the second highest rate of AP pass in the nation. So these are just a few examples of how outcomes can be incentivized in these formulas.
As an analyst, especially, I mean, I know probably numbers are one of your favorite things, but when you see this and you see some of the resistance from folks who just say, well, you can't put a number on success, or you can't, I mean, you hear some crazy stuff when people talk about this. And, of course, the moniker of, if you're asking for some kind of, if you're for some kind of accountability, some kind of linkage, that you just don't want to fund children, right? I mean, this is the immediate knee jerk. Well, you just don't like education. Then that's not what I said. I said we want to get, we want to get good results for our money. I'm not saying we shouldn't fund it. I'm saying we should get. But this is kind of the reaction. What are your thoughts as you look as kind of a numbers person? What do you think when you look at that and see those kind of arguments?
It's interesting you asked me that. I think that there are so many ways in which schools are built to serve the interests of the adults in the building. Children need to be the focus of this, and I think the one thing we can all agree on is that we want our children to be as prepared as possible for this world that they are about to go into once they've graduated. And it seems to me that it is almost stating the obvious. Well, of course I care about children. I would not be in this field if I did not care about getting these things. My issue is that we're not delivering. We are not actually creating these outcomes for students. And there's a certain point where more money isn't going to help until we change our approach, until we focus this funding to actually get the outcomes we're looking for. Because after a certain point, we're, by some rankings, we're 6th in the nation for our per pupil funding. We are always up there. We are always at the bottom of the NAEP rankings. So I see such an obvious problem here that we have tried to increase money before and it has not worked. So we need to be thinking innovatively about how to make these increases pay off for students.
I'm reminded of Einstein's old quote, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over. And that seems to be what we're asked, not changing the way we're doing things, not changing the methodology, but just saying, it's throughput. If we just put more through, it'll be better in the end. If we just put more money into it, it'll be better in the end. And that, unfortunately, is not, it's just not the case. It is the definition of insanity. And there are many other ways that you and I have talked about to try and make that money go further. And whether that's a decrease in overhead and administrative costs, we've talked about the consolidation of, many different, we get all these different school districts, all with duplicative efforts of administrators and overheads and secretaries and vice, whatever, and all that stuff, or anything else. And yet none of those things seem to be an attractive option for most of these people. And I think it goes back to what you just said, that this is built to serve the adults in the room rather than necessarily focusing on the kids.
Absolutely. And I really have high hopes because this pandemic jolted a lot of parents out of just the acceptance of public schools as the default and as the best way to educate their kids. And I really do have high hopes that we see more innovative education solutions because students need these options now. They cannot afford to wait until some nebulous time when this funding has kicked in and now our public schools are all better because we've gotten more money. It is not to say that funding couldn't be increased and could be made to do well. But like you said, we need to be thinking about accountability for outcomes too. That we cannot have these conversations about spending without thinking about the outcomes that they are getting us.
No, I mean that's no business would do that. Quality of product
Absolutely.
would be paramount at the end, even as you talk about investment and return and all that kind of stuff. But the quality of the product must remain paramount. Otherwise, I guess this is what happens when you have a monopoly on everything, and that's what this is. This is a state-run monopoly on education, with dollars that are taken from us, and we've got to let our voice be heard on this. Sarah Montalbano is our guest. We're going to continue here in just a moment, and we're going to talk with her not only about the COVID funds that are at the various schools, but also the Alaska Policy Forum's got a big event this week, so we wanted to give her a chance to talk about that as well. So we're going to continue in just a moment. Sarah Montalbano, our guest, The Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. Back with more after this.
Listened to by more staffers in Juneau than any other show, because their bosses told them to. And after what they just heard, oh man, they're going to be pissed.
You're a bad, bad man.
The Michael Duke Show.
You can smile. It's fine.
I'm doing well. I was looking at this Reason article that someone linked.
Oh, yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, Reason has been doing a lot of good work recently on some of the education things. And I don't know who writes this one, but I know Corey DeAngelis. We've had him on the program several times talking about this since the pandemic began. And they've got a real good handle, I think, on a lot of the things that are going on as well over there. I mean, this is frustrating for those of us who've been arguing for it, like I said, because anytime we start talking about, okay, we'll consider your education increase, but we also want to look at, maybe getting a little bit better of a deal on it. And they're like, whoa, why do you hate children? That was not what I said. That was not what I said, but that seems to be the case. Now, you're a lot closer to your school years than I am, right? And so when you look back at this and you say things like, it seems like they're focusing on the needs of the adults versus the needs of the kids. I mean, you've seen some of this, and you've dove down into some of the numbers on this and talked about this. The administrative, I mean, there are certain school districts in this state that have got 2 or 3 administrative overhead people to teachers. I mean, in smaller districts, it's like, how many counselors or secretaries do you need compared to the number of teachers in the classroom?
Yeah. I mean, I've looked at this. My school years, I really loved. Public schools served me really well. And that's one of the things that feels odd about this profession to me, is that I am not one of these people who was homeschooled and now is a champion for school choice. I just saw so many of my friends not get what they need from schools. And that was just really, really heartbreaking to see, like, these outcomes are not happening for a lot of kids. And that's one of the reasons I like talking about this and seeing the numbers, because the numbers really paint the picture.
Yeah, no. And again, it's like you said, I'm glad you said that, because, we do see that sometimes from some of these talking heads and people in education, especially in the choice arena, where they're like, well, of course you want choice. You came from a homeschool environment and you want it. And Sarah's like, no, I was down there brick and mortar with the stoners out back. She wasn't.
I was not.
But you know what I mean? She was there. She saw the public school. She's a product of it. And yet she still goes, maybe we should. And, we all saw that. I think if we all look back at our educational, even going back into the Wayback Machine for me, and remembering some of those kids who they just didn't get it. They just didn't, they needed that extra help. They knew all those things. It's a tough situation. And if we don't have some kind of accountability, then I guess we'll just be right back here in another 2 years asking for more, right? Because that last round of funding wasn't enough at that point.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason I'm not a politician is I don't like having all of these difficult, debates and compromises in the legislature. But, one-time funding is something that could plug the gap for now, but we will be talking about it next time if it's not dealt with. And then this is, first of all, not an issue specific to Alaska. Districts around the country are facing this because, in no small part, COVID relief funding allowed them to kick the can down the road a little bit. And they're plugging up their labor costs with this, and they're not thinking about their, long-term declines in enrollment too. So
we're
we're
we're looking at you, Anchorage School District.
yeah,
You
it's
know,
not unique.
no, it's not. And that's what I mean. Again, I'm, not a brain surgeon, nor do I play one on TV, but I'm just thinking that if you take one-time funding and use it to pay for ongoing reoccurring costs, you're setting yourself up for a bit of failure there. It just seems like that seems like that's a little bit foolhardy.
It does. Yeah. And we've been talking about this since these relief funds came out, that it is risky to put recurring costs on this one-time funding. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in Alaska and nationwide. Is just districts have come to this fiscal cliff, and the money's running out in 2024.
Yeah.
So they've got to start thinking about the choices they need to make now. And that's exactly what we're seeing.
And nationally, I mean, the money could be running out soon. I mean, with everything that's going on nationally, from this discussion on BRIC and breadbasket currencies to everything else, plus the fiscal cliff and all that, the money just could be flat running out. It's not just, it could be a tough situation. We best get a handle on it now, right? I mean, that's the thing. All right. That tells us we're about ready to jump back into it. Sarah Montalbano is our guest. We're going to talk a little bit first about their event, and then we'll move on to discussions of the COVID monies. That's what it was. I know what I'm talking about. Back with more of the Michael Duke Show, common sense, liberty-based, free thinking radio. Now.
The Michael Duke Show. Seriously humorous with a pinch of intellect. Sorry. That is humorous. Here's Michael Dukes.
I mean, it's a pinch. Is that an actual finite? Is that amount? Is that really a measurement?
It's a measurement.
It's a
I've
measurement.
heard that.
It's a pinch. No more, no less. Just a pinch, just to sweeten it up. Sarah Montalbano is our guest, senior education policy analyst with the Alaska Policy Forum. And we're talking about education and the base student allocation. We're going to talk about COVID funds. But before we get to that, we're going to talk a little bit about a big event that they've got coming up this Thursday. It's a webinar. Sarah, tell us what APF is doing here for the public and everything else on Thursday.
Yeah, I hope all of you join me Thursday, first of all, time and date. It's Thursday, April 13th, 7 p.m. Alaska time. So hopefully those of you working during the day can join us. We are going to meet the attorneys from the Institute for Justice who are defending Alaska's correspondence school allotment program. And so a quick background: in January 2023, a lawsuit was filed challenging this program, and some concerned parents, with the help of this public interest law firm, Institute for Justice, intervened to defend it. So we've obviously heard from some parents who are concerned about the future of the program. And we wanted to set up this opportunity to sit down with the attorneys and ask your questions, get your presentation about the frequently asked questions. So the first half will be these frequently asked questions we've heard from parents so far. And also, we encourage you to bring your own questions for the Q&A portion to ask the attorneys about the case. I'm happy to go in a little more detail. I'm obviously not a lawyer, so I can't really comment on the intricacies of the case. But what I know is that hundreds of families in Alaska are benefiting from the correspondence program. And this lawsuit is is threatening that. So we want you to join us. I have the registration link if you would like it. And I believe Michael already shared it on his page. So follow down into that description, get the registration link, and please, I really hope to see you. I'll be the moderator, so
Yeah.
you can hear more from me.
Well, yeah, and you're welcome to post the link in the chat room here if you like. With
Absolutely.
this. The genesis of this whole thing came from, in part, the circumstance of certain families in Anchorage utilizing portions of that funding to do things that were kind of out of the norm for various schools and classes and things like that. But this doesn't just affect that one school. This just doesn't affect just those one set of families that were doing something. Because we had, and I'm sorry, it's the Attorney General's wife, and I've totally forgotten her name here. She actually came on the program and talked to us about what they were doing with this and how they were utilizing these funds and how anybody could do this, and it would give them basically an opportunity to have some school choice. That's now been challenged, but it's not just those actions. This has ramifications on, like, all my kids have been homeschooled. We've done it through IDEA. We were one of the first, 15 or 20 families that joined IDEA back in the day. And we utilized it. It would threaten that as well. So this is not just one action on one area or one school. This could have ramifications on, school reimbursement for distance education across the whole state.
Indeed, this is my understanding as well, is that this is challenging the whole program in a broad sense. So this affects, all of the families that are in CSAP, who are thinking about CSAP, who might want to do it in future school years. I mean, this was enacted by the legislature in 2014, and we haven't had a problem for it up until now. So please bring your questions to this webinar. Wonderful. You've posted the link. Just click that, register, and I'll see you on Thursday.
All right. And Jess, Jody Taylor. That's who it was. Yes. Jody Taylor. I'm sorry. Getting old. Swiss cheese up here. That's what's going on. So Thursday, 7 p.m. You can follow the Zoom link. There's a Zoom link on here. I also have shared it to the Michael Duke Show Facebook page as part of the events section there. You can see it there, and you can participate if you'd like to be part of it. It'd be an interesting conversation. All right. Well, let's talk about the other elephant in the room. And you and I were just talking about this during the commercial break, which is the COVID funding. Obviously, the city of Kenai, who just denied that resolution for asking for more funds, one of the bones of contention was it's continuously the sky is falling. Every year there's some kind of crisis. Every year there's a shortfall. Every year we need more money. And yet we saw just this tremendous raft of money get floated out by the federal government, especially to education systems, because obviously education was shut down and there were things that had to be done and yada, yada, yada. This is a huge deal. Now we have districts that are sitting on a tremendous amount of money. What have you found as you look at Alaska and the different districts and the systems and how much money is out there? What have you found out about the COVID money that remains in Alaska unspent, and what could be done with that?
So in general, we've looked, the Department of Education publishes a dashboard, and they update that dashboard approximately quarterly, although they're not always on time with that. We have summarized updates on alaskapolicyforum.org. Our most recent one was March 2023, so very recently. Districts received $538 million in total. And they've spent 55% now. So a majority has been spent, but 45% remains. And that 45% is about $242 million left. In many of these districts, you can see we publish a table with all of the districts and how much they have left, how much they received per student. And so many districts still have 50% or more remaining. The end of the funding, I believe it expires in September 2024, something like that. So they'll have it through this upcoming school year. So that is going to be part of their budget discussions in the spring when they start to finalize the budget for the 2023-2024 school year.
And I mean, this is not an insignificant amount of money for some districts. I mean, even if they have 45 or 50% of that money's left, and yet they come to us. And again, this is short-term, finite amounts of funding. They could use it on a one-term basis to help bolster programs and things like that. But instead, we've seen many of these districts tackle reoccurring costs with one-time funding bonuses and then put themselves in an even deeper position. As you said earlier, this gives them the opportunity to kick the can down the road. And that is problematic. I mean, but you've got some districts out there with tens of millions of dollars still sitting there, right?
Yes, yes. And one of the things nationwide, I was looking at a very interesting article this morning from the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University, and they did a kind of nationwide survey of this thing. And they found that half of relief funds are paying for labor. There's 22 states that do provide some detail on what was purchased, and that was just under 50%. So they're, talking about continuity of operations and things like that. They're using this to, keep staff on, and they're not thinking about this perhaps permanent decline in enrollment in a lot of districts. A lot of districts are seeing this, and they're not paring back their staff yet to think about that. And we have to remember that staff is the biggest part of so many of these districts' cost, whether you're talking about teachers or administrators. It's all staff. They all get salaries and benefits, and that's a huge component of funding. So, we're paying for recurrent budget items. It's a really fantastic way to avoid thinking about these annual efforts that districts usually do to rein in these escalating costs or right-sizing their operating budgets. Usually they would be having hard conversations every spring about it, but now they're seeing the end of this cliff and going, oh gosh, we have so many positions. It's going to be, layoffs. It's going to be, a really scary time if we don't find extra sources of funding for this.
Well, and as you said, I think the thing that nobody seems to really is they're treating this as if it's a one-time spike in student enrollment decline, when in many cases it's a continual. I mean, no, this is an ongoing thing, especially in Alaska post-COVID. We saw a significant increase in homeschooling and other correspondence type schools, and that's going to take that money straight out of the district. Less than 60 seconds. I'll give you the final word there.
Yeah, I would just say that, we've been watching this since it was started, and we're seeing a lot of the consequences now. Districts need to be having these hard conversations. My last plug for you is that if you know a young person or you are a young person yourself, please consider our internship program. We're recruiting for summer 2023. I had a great time, and I hope to see some applications.
Because that's where you came from. You were an intern.
It is.
Right, exactly.
I was.
Sarah Montalbano from the Alaska Policy Forum. Thanks for coming on and joining us, folks. We're out of time for this hour. Coming up next, James Bartlett, author, right here on The Michael Duke Show. I wish we'd had more time to get into that idea, Sarah, and this is, one of those things that kind of just happens organically during our conversations. I wish we'd had more time to get into that discussion about enrollment decline and what is the new number, because I think many administrators in their arrogance think, oh, well, that's just a COVID thing and it'll come back. But I think that there's a big change. I think that there's a fundamental shift going on, whether it's a paradigm shift or dichotomy shift, whatever you want to call it, in how education is done. And we're going to see that enrollment, a good portion of that could be permanent.
Yeah, I was going to say I've actually got one number off the top of my head. Correspondence school enrollment spiked to about 92% higher, almost doubled from its pre-pandemic. And now it is still 42% elevated. So a lot of the people that tried this are sticking with it. So that's, a permanent enrollment shift we've seen.
So they had almost 100% increase, and now they're finding that almost half of them are going to stick with it afterwards. That's huge. I mean, that is a huge, huge number. And I think that we discount that at our peril, I think, and I think school administrators discount that at their peril as well. So
absolutely.
Well, it's always good to see you. You're going to be hosting the webinar on Thursday. You're going to be the moderator. All right.
I am.
Good for
Yeah.
you. Look, coming up
It's
in
going
the
to be a
world.
late night.
Pretty soon you're going to be hosting your own radio show. That's how it's going to work around there.
I'd be delighted, but I don't want to.
Yeah.
Not yet.
I can't take the competition, so it's fine. So,
Thank you very much.
Sarah Montalbano, our guest. Thank you, Sarah, for coming on board. It's good to talk with you. We will talk with you again soon.
Thank you very much. Talk soon.
All right. Thanks for coming on board. All right. That means we're into hour 2. I see that our next guest, James Bartlett, is on the program. He's in the green room right now. We're going to go ahead and before I get to all the comments here, let's go over here and test some audio and see and make sure everything's good to go with Mr. Bartlett. He joins us. He joins us right now. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Hello, Michael. Can you hear me?
I can. You sound.
Can you hear me at all?
I can hear you. Yes, I can. You're all good.
Great. That's good. I always feel awkward in these headphones, so yeah, I'm glad that you can hear me.
These are actually surgically welded to my head, so I don't know what you're talking about. It's fine. Well, I'm excited to talk a little bit about your book and to get some backstory. Being an old Fairbanks boy myself, I found it was some interesting stuff. So I'm looking forward to talking with you about that. So if you'll hold the line, I'll be right back to you. I'm going to put you back in the green room and we'll be right back to you. Okay.
Sure.
All right. So don't go anywhere. James Bartlett, author of the book, the Alaskan Blonde. We're gonna talk about this because it's an interesting true crime story, and I think a little bit of a fascinating piece of history. So it'll be good. So let me go back here into the chat room to see what you guys have been talking about while I was on with Sarah Montalbano. See if there's any comments here. Brian did link that article from Reason Magazine on the schools and the overcrowding. Local contributions. There are local contributions, impact aid, which is just 90%, but the formula is not the correct focus. The focus is the amount of money being sent to the districts after the calculations are done. But we also need to focus on the formula as well. I think we need to do both. I think we can do both. And I know that you've talked about that if we don't break into the formulas, then we're wasting our time. I know that you've said that as well. Can't we stop calling them public schools? Well, I mean, we could. Is Bethany still with a policy form? I believe so. Bethany Markham, is that who you're talking about? I believe she is. You hate the children is the only retort they have when they cannot come up with a cogent argument. I mean, that is kind of a straw man argument when we've heard those kind of things, that any kind of discussion on accountability and other things immediately becomes, well, why do you hate us? That's not what we said. What we said was, if we're going to spend more money on it, we need to make sure that there's a metric in place to track the results. I mean, that just seems like, if I'm going to have a contractor come in and do work on my house, I need to have a metric. There's a metric in place for how he's doing, built into a contract. That's how it works. You're tracking how the work is being done. Let's see here. Going through here. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Light snow showers in the Kenai. Yeah, it's snowing here. I mean, this is the winter that will never end. All right. I'm serious. This is the winter that will never. It was all nice. We could see the roads. Things were melting down. And then we got another 2 inches of snow because reasons. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. There's always, okay. Thank you. School districts, Donna Ardwin making the point that school districts make money from correspondence schools. That's what's going on. All right. I guess that's it. I'm all caught up. I'm all caught up in the chat room, and we are 60 seconds away from the restart. And we've still got our guest, author James Bartlett, in the chat room. And we're going to talk with him here in just a second about his book, The Alaskan Blonde, Sex, Secrets, and the Hollywood Story That Shocked America, which, by the way, born and raised in Fairbanks, had never heard of this story. I mean, it just shows you how out of time these things can be. I mean, this is 70 years ago. I just didn't even know about it. Interesting. So let's get into it. Here we go. We're going to jump back and get things started. Hour 2 of the Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. We return to kick things off of the radio here in about 30 seconds. Don't go anywhere.
Whoa, buddy. Put that thing back in its holster. We haven't gone anywhere.
I don't understand.
Check out the MichaelDukesShow.com for information on how to get access to the podcast.
Welcome to the party, pal.
The Michael Dukes Show.
The greed and the entitlement is astounding to me.
What more could you want from a low-budget radio program?
This is a dumpster fire.
That was just BS.
It is time to get a new perspective.
We know just what you need, and we've got just the cure. Open wide and prepare for a steaming hot cup of freedom.
I just don't fathom it.
The Michael Dukes Show, streaming live across the world.
That's right, across the world on the internet at michaeldukeshow.com, where you'll find links to our audio-only live stream and, of course, links to our social media sites where we simulcast the radio show every morning on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. We're everywhere. We're omnipresent. And, of course, broadcasting live across the state of Alaska on this, your favorite radio station and or FM translator. Welcome to Monday. If you're just getting up and joining us, good morning. Welcome to the winter that never ends. We were just talking about that. It will not stop. Over 100 inches of snow in Anchorage for it's like the 9th or 7th time since they started tracking it back in the early 50s. It's been a while. Just more snow and cold, and summer is coming eventually. That's all. Summer is coming. It's like the opposite of the Game of Thrones. Summer is coming. It'll eventually be here. But I thought we would change gears just a little bit. Now, normally we do a lot of politics and things like that, local state stuff. But I always like to kind of mix it up. And we've been doing a whole discussion on Alaskan authors and some of the other things that we've been doing. Today is a little bit different. Today is, instead of an Alaskan author, it's a story about Alaska. With author James Bartlett. He is a journalist, has written a new book. It's the true crime book called The Alaskan Blonde, Sex, Secrets, and the Hollywood Story That Shocked America. And it takes a look at a true crime story that happened in the interior 70 years ago. James was a travel and lifestyle journalist and historian. He's written for the LA Times, the BBC, High Life, Westways, Fromers, Crime Reads, The Guardian. He's got a list that's as long as your arm. But I really wanted to talk about this book because it takes place in my old hometown of Fairbanks. And it was a story that I had never heard of before, which, again, from being in my hometown, I thought that was a little strange that I'd never heard about it. So let's jump into it today and get the full rundown on everything that's happening with author James Bartlett, who joins us right now. Good morning, sir. How are you doing? Oh, we lost your audio. Your audio was good in the break, and now the audio is not there. You're not muted on my end. Did you mute yourself?
No.
There you go. Oh, you just cracked. There you go. Now I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. I can hear you now. Like the Verizon commercial. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now? So, James, thanks for coming on the program. I really appreciate it. First, give us a little bit of background about yourself, just so that we know, who you are, where you come from. You obviously don't sound Alaskan, but that's okay. That's okay. That happens. So give us a little bit of background on yourself before we start talking about the story and what happens there. So first, a little background.
Yeah, well, as you say, I'm not from Alaska or America at all. I'm from England originally, from London, about 15 miles north of London. But I've lived here in the States for coming up to 20 years now. Actually, my wife is American. So I moved over here to be with her about 20 years ago. And I've worked as a journalist for around about 20 years, a little bit longer than that. And the way I got into this story, or got into an Alaskan story, and of course, much like many people, I knew very little about Alaska. I knew it was a long way away. I knew it was enormous. I knew there was a relatively small population, but I didn't know anything about that. It was never something that I figured I would spend any time, certainly not, maybe not visiting or researching. But my background was journalism, travel and lifestyle journalism and so forth. But when I moved to Los Angeles, as someone new in a very big city, I did try and explore a little and try and work my way around, because it's a huge place. And I like libraries and I like archives. So I looked into the newspapers and I looked into history, and I ended up writing a couple of guidebooks, sort of alternative guidebooks to Los Angeles, mainly because I couldn't find a guidebook that I thought was fun, that was that had a number of places where you could actually go, bars, restaurants, and hotels, and you could
Right.
read the history of a place, and you could read about the architecture, and you could read what food and drink you could get. But then you could also read stories about celebrity stories, or even ghost stories, and some crime stories. And that was the thing that really started to pull me in, was the crime stories, looking through the archives. And
Right.
that led to the book, The Alaskan Blonde.
Well, and that's interesting because we know that, I mean, all you have to do is follow the trends on podcasts and other things. And we understand that true crime is a huge draw for people to try and get into the minds and the old stories of things that happened and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, you were perfectly positioned for that niche market that's really been
I was
taking off.
very, very lucky. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, the first book, first guide I did was in 2012. So I just had a jump on it there, and I found out immediately how incredibly popular it was, and
Yeah.
that led me to do a second book, and I was hosting a true crime book club, and it really became something that everyone was interested in. Everyone wanted to know more, especially historical crime.
Right.
Because 100 years ago you could buy poison. 100 years ago, murders weren't often solved.
Right.
Society was very different, and I think we take a lot more interest and sometimes even a comfort in that, rather
Right.
than something that's contemporary.
So, I guess my first question is, again, the genesis of the book. Why Alaska specifically? Why? I mean, there's plenty of true crime all up and down the West Coast, right there in California, LA, your area, San Francisco. But why Alaska? What was the thing that tripped you into the last frontier?
Well, like many things, I guess, is often the way. It was chance. It really was chance. I was researching the second guidebook that was all crime based, true crime based, and I would look for bars and restaurants and hotels, and then I would look up their history to see if any crimes had happened there. And often, especially in hotels, there had been. And there was a hotel in Hollywood here called the Hollywood Plaza Hotel that was very famous in the 30s and 40s, and it had a restaurant underneath, so it qualified for the book theoretically. And then I went to look into the history of the hotel, see if anything bad had ever happened there, and I found a few things. But I found this story about this. There's obviously going to be some spoilers,
Right.
spoiler alerts here, but
We'll
I
we'll
found
call it spoiler light, right? It'll just be little.
I'll keep it
Yeah.
spoiler light, but it will have to come out in the end. But yes, I found there was a story related to this Hollywood Plaza Hotel that was related to Fairbanks, and related to a murder that had happened in Fairbanks in October 1953. And I read the story. It was an LA Times report, because I was researching the local newspapers here. And I read the story and I thought, wow, I wonder what happened there. That sounds like an amazing story. I also thought it was a very modern story, despite happening 70 years ago. It seemed like it could have happened yesterday. It seemed the way the story happened. And I thought to myself, well, I'll have to read the book. I'll have to get the book out and read the book, or I'll have to listen to the radio coverage, or I'll have to listen to, the articles that people wrote about it, because this
Right.
is such an interesting story. It must have been covered at the time. And then I Googled it and did the research that I did, and nothing really came up. And that was really what initially piqued my curiosity, was, why is there nothing about this? It sounds such an amazing story that like we always like to imagine, is you couldn't make it up. You couldn't
Right.
make up this story. And then I began to think to myself, well, I wonder if any of the people who were involved are still around today. I wonder if, perhaps this is just a one-off article, maybe, and maybe I could find them and ask, so what happened? No one ever wrote about this story. What happened? And as you said, you're from Fairbanks yourself. You've lived there for decades and you'd never heard of this. And that was very much true when I spoke to the family members, when I first spoke to them, and all the way through my research. It was a story that was completely pretty much swept under the carpet. It really wasn't talked about, certainly amongst the family members. I was amazed when I spoke to the family members. They nearly all said to me, well, what do you know? Because it was never spoken to about us. We never spoke about it. It was a family secret. No one ever said anything. And, I'm 75 and I have no idea what happened. All I know is that my uncle, my brother, my grandfather was murdered and they think this and this happened. But that's all that I've ever known.
So give us some backstory. Set the story. Set the scene as to what happened in Fairbanks 70 years ago. That is kind of the basis for what your story is and what you've discovered.
Okay, well, I'll give you the elevator pitch, as they say. I presume you've got some listeners who are in Fairbanks. Hello to all of them. So they will know where I'm talking about, and you certainly will as well. But so it was October the 17th. 1953, about 7:15 in the morning, and Diane Wells, who is the Alaskan Blonde, that's who the book is named after. She's the lady on the cover. That's a real picture of her at Seattle Airport. She banged on a neighbor's door of the Northwood building. She and her husband Cecil lived in the Northwood building with their young son. The Northwood building is still there in Fairbanks. It's one of the tallest buildings in downtown. It's 8 stories high. It's quite a distinctive silver sort of H-shaped building. And at the time,
the Ice Palace. That's what it's
the
called.
Ice Palace. Yes,
Right, yeah.
it's still known locally as the Ice Palace from a 1960 movie and a 1958 book, an Edna Ferber book that was about Alaska and its search for territorial status around a romantic melodrama. But it was the Ice Palace later. But at the time, it was a new building, the latest building. And Cecil and Diane Wells both lived there because they were very much an it couple of the town. But Diane that morning banged on her neighbor's door. She was hysterical. She said that 2 men had broken in the middle of the night, shot her husband Cecil while he was asleep in bed, beaten her up. She had 2 black eyes and a cut face, stolen some money and jewelry, and run away. So the police came and investigated, and initially they thought it was a robbery turned violent. There had been a few locally, and they thought it was another example of this. But then the police got a tip-off that she had been having an affair, or allegedly having an affair, with a local musician who was a black guy named Johnny Warren. And that changed the story completely. The main thing that it changed was that stories from territorial Alaska at the time didn't really tend to make the press in the lower 48 or anywhere else, particularly maybe other than the politics,
Right.
and anything related to military stuff. This story did, though. This was covered on all the wires, all the way across America. It was even covered across internationally as well because of this angle, the affair. There was the affair between a white woman and a black man, and of course the very film noir element that Cecil was a very rich middle-aged businessman, the victim, and his wife Diane was his 5th wife. She was 20 years younger than him, and as you can see from the picture on the book, she was young and glamorous and blonde and, had fantastic hair and was beautiful. And that was all the elements of like a film noir story. So the police then kind of zeroed in their investigation on Diane and Johnny Warren and figuring that perhaps the 2 of them had conspired in order to kill Cecil, in order to get Cecil's money, which was imagined to be maybe $1 million or more. He had a lot of investments, mining, real estate. He was a huge auto dealer in Anchorage first, actually. Very big connection to Anchorage. He's buried in Anchorage. He had a big connection to Anchorage first before going up to Fairbanks, and they assumed it was about the money that he had. He was an investor in the Chena Hot Springs, which is super
Right.
famous, which
Right.
everybody knows. And so the book looks again at the investigation, the police investigation. So I got the FBI files, I got the police files, and looked again at the investigation and what they did, and how the family thought about it and what the family thought at the time. I interviewed the family members, and then in the book I lay it out chronologically, and in the last chapter I put what I think happened on the night of the murder, because
Little
it never came to trial. No one was ever convicted in relation to it. That's part of the story, obviously.
That's interesting. All right. Well,
Yeah.
don't let's not burn everything up here, because
Yeah.
we're going to take a commercial break. We're going to come back here in just a minute. We're talking with James Bartlett. He's the author of the true crime book, The Alaskan Blonde. Again, a true story that takes place in Fairbanks 70 years ago, 1953, coming up in October of 1953. We're going to continue here in just a moment. Don't go anywhere. We're going to continue. James Bartlett will return in just a moment. The Michael Duke Show, common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. A little bit of a change of pace today. Finding out about some interesting stuff. We will continue with more in just a moment. Don't go anywhere. Back with more after this.
We're broadcasting live through a series of tubes.
Allowing all of these entities to provide streaming stuff going on the internet.
Well, it's kind of hard to explain. Sorry. Streaming live every weekday morning on Facebook Live and MichaelDukesShow.com.
Okay, in the break right now, James Bartlett, our guest here on the program. You've written some other books too, and I know my wife is interested. She loves true crime, but she also loves paranormal. I know you wrote a book. Again, you were talking about ghost stories in the Los Angeles area and things like that. Some of your guidebooks. One of them is the was it the Ghost Gourmet Ghost?
Gourmet Ghost, yes, that's right.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that and some of the stories about that while we're in the break. We like to mix it up while we're in the
they again enormously popular as a subject. The supernatural and ghosts and ghost stories especially. And they were the two guides that I wrote, were called Gourmet Ghosts. Gourmet Ghost 1 and Gourmet Ghost 2. And they were initially, the first book especially, was based around ghost stories that I was being told in bars and restaurants and hotels when I would go and visit and sit at the bar. And the bartender or some of the staff would, start talking to you, and they'd tell you maybe a bit of the history of the building and so forth. And almost inevitably, a ghost story would come out, or a ghost story or two. And I was kind of amazed because, being a journalist, you try and be sort of impartial and take everyone at their word and do your research to find out what they're telling you. Because, of course, a ghost story, theoretically, you can never prove a ghost story. So what I did, and that was the point of the books, was I would listen to the story, and then I would look it up in the newspapers at the address of the building to see if anything had happened there, to see if it could in any way connect to the apocryphal story. And I was amazed when like 8 or 9 or 10 of the stories had some connection. Had been a crime at these buildings that related to the ghost story that people told, which amazed me. And that just set me off on a rabbit hole. People would say, you need to go to this place, you need to go to this hotel, you need to go to that hotel, you need to go to that bar. That place is 100 years old, go there. Go and ask them about X, Y, and Z. Go and ask them about booth 8. Go and ask them. And I just collected all these stories into these 2 books. And that morphed into some crime ones, because, of course, a lot of murders and so forth were often crime related.
Right.
And that led to the second book, which was more crime. The first book is very ghost story. The second book is very crime. And I will say, all the stories that people told me, I believed that they had definitely seen something or had a frightening or a strange experience of some kind. I never really thought that anyone was really stringing me along.
Right.
In so much as you can be. And there were some really good stories that I especially when they would tell me the story, I would look them up in the archives, and there were some that directly related to the story that I've been and there was no way they could know, because I was doing some deep research. There was no way the people telling me these stories could have known about these things. And some of them I thought to myself, that's exactly the story you're telling me. That actually happened.
That's crazy. Do you cover the Cecil Hotel, just out of curiosity?
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, that was in the second book. I had to put it in because,
Yeah.
as you probably know, or as many of the people know, that was the hotel in 2013 where the Canadian Chinese tourist Elisa Lam was found in the water tank at the top. Very strange and tragic story. She was found in the water tank, dead, at the top of the Cecil Hotel, and the Cecil Hotel has been another 100-year-old hotel, close enough.
Right.
Again, another hotel that in its day was extremely luxurious, very, very high end. But that hotel, as I found in my research, has an inordinate number of crimes and strange stories associated with it.
Yeah.
Way more, more suicides, murders, serial killers, stalkers, baby murderers, every single sniper, everything you can imagine has happened at that Cecil Hotel.
Yeah, it's
Um,
amazing. You watch her behavior at the very end there. They've got video and stuff, and it's
it's
so
very
bizarre.
strange.
And then,
Yeah,
of
and
course,
and that became yeah.
yeah, you find out that the Satanist and the
Yeah, it's
serial
such an
killer
odd
there. It's just
video of her
so good.
in the elevator, and the elevator's this still there. I've been to the Cecil Hotel a couple of times doing TV stuff, and the elevators are still there. You
Yeah,
stand in the same hotel and stand in the corner where she was, and she looked distressed and
yeah.
unhappy and very unsettled at something that was
Well,
going
we're
on.
gonna we're gonna jump back in here and continue. Our guest, James Bartlett, author of the book "The Alaskan Blonde," The Michael Duke Show, common sense, liberty-based, free thinking radio. Like and share the show. Like and follow. Make sure you hit it on Facebook and YouTube. Let's do it. Welcome back to the program. We're continuing now. Our guest is James Bartlett, author of several different books, but most recently we're talking about his book, The Alaskan Blonde. It's a true crime story out of Fairbanks. Very interesting. Like I said, I had never heard of it. And as he pointed out earlier, that's because this is kind of like the story that nobody really knew about. And of course, still unresolved to this day. James, you were talking about how you went and did some deep dive. You did some research. You found, you went through the FBI files. What are some of the interesting things that you pulled out? I mean, we're not looking for spoilers, but some of the interesting things that you pulled out of these accounts and interviews and the research in the FBI files. What did you find?
Well, I guess there's a lot of things. I'm going to go straight to one of the ends from the things that I found in relation to the book was that in talking to some of the relatives of the people who were around at the time, because of course 70 years ago, none of the people who were there at the time are alive anymore, but their children are, and even their grandchildren, and some of them knew about the case or had remembered that their father mentioned it. And there was a guy who was a deputy marshal at the time. He later worked for the Fairbanks PD and was a firefighter in Fairbanks. And he was directly involved in the case from the beginning. He actually extradited Johnny Warren when Johnny Warren was arrested he was actually in Oakland, California, and he was extradited back to Fairbanks because Johnny Warren and Diane Wells were charged with the murder of Cecil Wells. So he was directly involved in the case, and I managed to track down his children, and they told me that he had an unpublished memoir. And I said,
Oh,
well,
wow.
is there any chance that he mentioned this case? Because as I say, despite what it seems, it was a sensation at the time. It was sort of a short-lived sensation. It was sort of a 7th-month story with a lot happening at the beginning. Then there was a gap before the trial began, or the trial was supposed to begin, and then there was a lot that happened at the end. And they had an unpublished memoir, and they said, yes, he does mention it. And there were a couple of things that he mentioned in the memoir that he firstly hadn't mentioned and weren't in any of the police files. And secondly, that he had mentioned that were in the police files, but that he had now also mentioned privately, which really made me think that what he was thinking had some real basis behind it. So that was one of the things in the book. Other things, as far as the police files go, it seems like they, as you might imagine, this being 70 years ago, the police service in Fairbanks was pretty underfunded.
Right.
and small, and they did not have a lot of facilities. Of course, the technology was nothing like we imagine today. Um, and the main thing that I got from the files, I guess, in terms of the actual physical evidence, was that they never found the gun. They never found the murder weapon. And as true crime fans probably know, it's often very hard to prove a murder case beyond reasonable doubt if you don't have a weapon that matches the bullets.
Right.
It's always difficult, and I found that in the end, the Fairbanks PD actually sent 4 guns to the FBI over. This would have been over 7 years. They actually kept investigating the case for 7 years, from 1953 to 1960, and they sent 4 guns that they found, and none of them ever matched. And they went to some extraordinary lengths to try and find a match to match the gun to the bullets. And they never managed to do that. And really, it was clear very early on, despite what it sounds like, that it was a very circumstantial 50-50 case at best.
Yeah.
But one of the big factors in the story was that, as I'm sure all your listeners will know, being 1953 in the late 50s, becoming a territory was a big deal for Alaska. And it really did seem to get a little bit swept up in that, because it was quite a high profile murder, and he was a well-known person. He was head of the Alaska Chamber of Commerce. He was well known, and for him to be shot at home in his bed and no one to be immediately arrested and go to prison for the crime didn't look great. And I think there was definitely some thought and discussion at some stage of, look, we need to make this kind of go away if we can, because this is not helping us.
Right, because it's kind of overshadowing our bid for territorial status or
Very
statehood.
much. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
the police system and the jail system was not great, which I talk about in the book. And of course, that's an issue. That's an issue if you're applying to be, a state, because you know very well that DC and so forth is saying, well, okay, how do you run your territory? How do you run
Right.
it? How do you deal with crime? How do you deal with law and order? Hang on, we've just seen a picture of like this guy who, is the head of the Alaska Chamber of Commerce, a millionaire businessman, has just been shot in his bed, and you haven't got a suspect. What's going
Right.
on here?
Right.
And there had been a number of other robberies in Fairbanks with prominent local businessmen at home invasions. 2 men had broken into houses and said, "Give me all your money." There'd been several of them, and it was not, as we say today, it was not good optics. And as
Right.
this case went on, and this case became something that was in the US press, it became a thing. And because they weren't solving it, and it didn't look like they were getting close to it, it was a problem, I think. And that became a real factor. And politics always plays a part in almost every crime, especially, because Alaska still had the death penalty at the time. Technically, I mean, Johnny Warren was technically facing the death penalty if he was found guilty.
Right.
And so that became an issue as well. That was a thing I really didn't anticipate finding out. Now, it's not directly mentioned in the police files, of course, because that's not their business.
Right.
But when you do research, which I had to do around the history of Alaska and around the history of Fairbanks and Anchorage as well, as the two big cities, it was a real eye-opener into the history generally of Alaska and how it took so long for them to get territorial status. I assumed, being from England, that all the states basically just got it all in a row. They all just lined up, and
Yeah,
it was just a click of that, a rubber stamped, really, because they all
Right.
wanted to. It turns out it wasn't that at all. The
Yeah.
same for Hawaii. Hawaii
Right.
was doing the same thing at the time.
Well, it's interesting to say. I mean, what were did you get a feel for the ramifications of not just on the territorial statehood scale, but what about the local community? I mean, the reaction from the local community and how it felt. Like you said, there were already other crimes going on. What
Yeah.
did this do in the communities? Did this create a fervor? Was this, was
You're
this
absolutely
fear-based?
right.
I mean, what was going on there?
Yes, you're absolutely right. That's a good question. You're absolutely right. Yes, it did. The community was already a bit up in arms about the level of crime, as most communities often are. Crime is never something we can ignore and doesn't happen very often. The community was in an uproar, and this took things to a kind of hysterical level. I mean, the chief of police at the time, who was new to the job, he'd just been in a few months, He only lasted about 6 weeks before he resigned. I mean, everybody wanted in on this particular one. Everyone had an opinion. It became a, for want of a better word, territorial thing. So there was the local police, the troopers, the FBI was involved. Everyone seemed to be sticking their nose in and wanting to get this sorted out. And of course, what happened was they weren't communicating with each other, and time went on. And again, a suspect wasn't being, quote unquote, they were being arrested and charged. But both Diane Wells and Johnny Warren, got out on bail. Diane immediately came down to Los Angeles, and that's how the Hollywood Los Angeles element of the book comes into it.
Right.
And how I could find out so much living here, because she came down to Los Angeles straight away when she got out on bail. But interestingly, Johnny, who was possibly the one who was in the most jeopardy in a way, because, this was Jim Crow America in that particular period, he was very much being looked at as a bit of the villain of the piece. She was the gold digging blonde, but he was the villainous black guy, the musician.
Right. Because it was a different, again, 70 years ago, totally different time in America. Right.
Totally different time in America. And so he stayed in Fairbanks, but interestingly, locally, as you said, he stayed living and working in Fairbanks. The people in Fairbanks didn't really seem to think that he had a lot to do with it. He kept his job. He worked at the Piggly Wiggly. He kept working as a musician. He was even employed by one of Cecil Wells's best friends and business partners to work for him, almost as a show of support for him. The public level of support for him was not really that he was involved. He may have had an affair with someone, which you shouldn't do, because, he was married and she was married. But public opinion wasn't so much against him. Public opinion was a lot more against her, because she was the young, attractive blonde, and people thought she was the nice ladies that I was talking to. They were using like the words card girl.
Right.
And,
stereotypical gold digger is what I think.
Yeah, they were using those kind of words. Most people had good things to say about her. They said she was a very nice person. She was great with kids. She was a young person. She had a difficult life of her own, which of course was what I discovered during the research of the book. But she seemed to be a good mother to her and Cecil's son, Mark. She seemed to love her kid, and she brought Mark down to Los Angeles to try and start over, at least for a few months before the trial began. But then there was a third suspect, as there always is. And he was in Fairbanks as well. And he'd come up from Anchorage about a year or two before. And this third suspect, whose name was William Columbany, he had been actually named publicly by the deputy marshal that I told you about, who'd done the extraditions. He'd been named publicly by him as being a man very much of interest in the case. And that doesn't usually happen.
Right.
Usually law enforcement don't say, you know what, Johnny Warren here. There's a picture in the book, which of course was never published. That was one of the most amazing things that I found, which his daughter sent me from his memoirs. There's a picture of him in the book with Johnny Warren, and Johnny Warren is in handcuffs because he'd just come back on the plane. He's been extradited. And the two of them are just laughing like two old friends. And it's such an odd picture to see, because you think, wait a minute, that guy is supposed to have murdered a man in cold blood, or at least have been involved in it. And the guy on the side of him is extraditing him back on a charge of first-degree murder. How come they seem so relaxed and happy? And the deputy marshal said publicly, he said, I don't think this guy had anything to do with it. He said that to reporters.
Right.
He said, I don't think this guy had anything to do with it. He was obviously involved, but I don't think he had anything to do with the murder. Now, for him to say that publicly was quite the deal.
We got just a couple 3 minutes here left, and I wanted to say, so it never went to they were charged.
Yeah, they were both charged. Now I can give you, if we're running out of time a little, I can give a little bit of a spoiler alert for the end. But yes, they were both charged. They were due to go to trial in April 1954. But unfortunately, Diane Wells, who'd come down to LA with her son, she had been on barbiturates, antidepressants, and she made the decision to take her own life in the end, rather than go to trial. She left several suicide notes, one specifically saying, I can't put my son through this, the humiliation, the publicity of a trial. It will follow him all his life. And I did manage to locate the son, who now, of course, is a much older gentleman indeed. And it kind of did follow him all through his life. He always worried about it. It was always something that he didn't have a particularly happy life. So it was a tragic ending all round, and John on the hook until 1960. He announced a trial a couple of times and postponed it again until 1960 post statehood. And then he got a letter that said, you exonerated. We're not pursuing the charges against you anymore, because they never really had any evidence against him.
Right. Well, I'm fascinated to read the book in its total. You can go to the alaskablonde.com, and James Bartlett has a link of where to buy it. I'm sure you could find it at major outlets, including Amazon. The alaskanblonde.com. James Bartlett is our guest, author of the book. James, thanks for coming on board and joining us today. It's an interesting, definitely an interesting conversation, especially a little piece of Alaska history that many of us are probably not aware of, even those of us who've lived and again, born and raised here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been an interesting conversation. And any final thoughts before I let you go?
I just wanted to say thank you to all the people in Alaska who've been so supportive of me and my research and the book, because I did think it was kind of a tough gig going up to somewhere, not even being American or Alaskan, going up somewhere and asking about a story from a long time ago, and, a tragic story that affected a lot of people over generations. But everyone was nothing more than helpful and generous and kind. And the reaction to the book's been really, really good. And people seem to have really liked it and have been really thought that it was interesting and a good bit of history. And that was really all I hoped for.
Well, that's all anybody could hope for. If somebody finds an interest in the things that you write, I think that's fantastic. All right, James, hold the line for just a second. Folks, we're out of time for this segment. We got more coming up. We're going to have one more segment after this. A little bit of open line, open forum. The Michael Duke Show continues. Common sense, liberty-based, free thinking radio.
Our light, our guide, and our trusted friend. Michael Duke Show.
Okay, in the break with James Bartlett. James, this is a fascinating story, and I definitely gonna have to get a copy of the book, and I know my wife is gonna, just suck that stuff up. She loves the true crime stuff, and it's interesting. Has this opened your eyes or given you an interest for more kind of Alaskan true crime? Because we are kind of an untapped market for some of that stuff, right? I mean, there are some interesting things that have happened here in the state.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that. When I came up to Fairbanks in October to do a few talks and a couple of signings, I promised I would come back when the book was finished. I'm sure people thought he's never going to do this, but I did go back and do some talks. And of course, people came up to me after them and said, "Did you ever hear about this? Did you ever hear about this?" People emailed me and sent me lots of stuff, and there were 2 or 3 interesting stories that I came across. And you're right, it's a completely untapped market, which I really found strange. Like I said, I found it strange that there wasn't a book about this one
Right.
to start with. You've got even in just in recent times, the pipeline, stories of stuff that's happened on the pipeline.
Sure.
People gave me lots of stories about that. And I think it's because, in part, I found out that certainly that Alaskans love history, especially Alaskans history, and they're voracious readers. That's what I found out. Massive readers. But I think it seems like they often get a bit of a raw deal from the rest of the states. I think the rest of the states kind of ignore them a little. And I don't think I'm preaching to the converted here,
Right.
I think.
Yeah,
but
no.
I think they get ignored a little, because when I went the first time to Fairbanks in 2018, I went to the Big Eye and I went to the couple of bars, and I talked to some of the old guys who were in there, because I knew they'd be the ones who might have been around or could remember it. And they said to me, we have tourists who come here, and, there's a lot of cruises these days, and a lot of people come for the Aurora, to Fairbanks especially, and they said, we have people who come here, Americans, from the lower 48, come up and say, well, we always thought Alaska was an island. And I said, well, how can they think Alaska's an island? Well, they see because on the news reports for the weather, it's in a little box like Hawaii is. So
Right,
they
right.
think it's an island because it's, that it's not and I think that a lot of people still think that.
Oh, yeah.
I think a lot of people aren't particularly well informed because a lot of Alaska news doesn't filter down,
Right.
and so I think in terms of, true crime stories, I mean, as I found out with this book, the Robert Hansen, the baker from
Butcher Baker,
Anchorage.
yeah. Butcher
Yeah.
Baker, yeah.
Now that was a hugely popular book and a well-known story. There's been a couple more recently that have had some Alaskan connections, but there really hasn't ever been, say, more than a couple of books about, say, serial killers, which are the big selling ones. And it's not that they haven't happened in Alaska. I just think people think, well, it's only Alaskans who are going to be interested in this.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the
Well,
case. I don't think that's the case.
I agree with you because I think Alaska is on a lot of people's minds. A lot of people dream of going to Alaska, or it's one of their things, their bucket lists or whatever.
Yeah.
And so kind of that conjunction of the true crime and Alaska. I mean, yeah, you've got Butcher Baker, you've got Israel Keys, you've got a few of these very, very well known, but there are dozens of other stories that are untold. And I think that's an important part. I think that's a missing component here. And more Alaskan stories. I think you could carve your niche on just good old Alaskan stories.
Well, that's it. It's not been too bad. I wouldn't be unhappy doing that, I tell you, because I really enjoyed it, and the research is fascinating. As you say, it's not something that's that well covered. I think maybe you're right. Perhaps people see it as some sort of like, wild, snowy paradise where nothing bad happens.
Right.
Maybe people think that. I think people think that about Hawaii.
Right.
Nothing bad must ever happen in Hawaii. Look at it. It's so far away and it's exotic. Nothing bad ever happens there. Whereas you get LA or New York, you think, oh yeah, bad stuff happens there. Lots of
Right.
people.
All the time. Right. Yeah.
It's got to be that way. But, human beings are human beings, and unfortunately bad stuff does happen. I mean, I went right back to the beginning of that. There was like a guy called the Blueberry Kid way back in like 19 and something, the early 20th. He was supposed to have killed like half a dozen people.
Right.
And there's nothing about that, but you look into Alaskan history and his name pops up.
Right.
But
it's Soapy Smith and the Blueberry Kid and some of the
Soapy
others.
Smith, yeah. I mean, and a lot of it's got to do with distribution as well. And as a lot of your listeners will know, deliveries and getting things delivered and stuff. It's because Alaska's so far away, it gets considered different. Like book distribution is done differently.
Right.
Certain things will not include Alaska in what
Right.
they're doing. And so that you have to be quite determined, and it has to be like this was an Alaskan book. I thought, well, I've got to do whatever's necessary because this is a book that happens in Alaska. If anywhere it's got to go, I've got to take it there.
Can you stick with us for the final segment? I don't have anything else going on.
Yeah, no. Yeah, whatever
I'd like
you like.
to talk about maybe the next part of this because I think that's true. I mean, I would encourage you to continue to pursue that. And but let's hold the line. We're 15 seconds out. The Michael Duke Show continues. We're going to continue with James Bartlett because we can, because I said so. Here we go. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. Like it, share, follow, subscribe, ring the bell. Let's do it. Okay, I made an executive decision and decided to keep James Bartlett on for one final segment. We got talking, and the next thing I know, we're out of the commercial break already. So I've asked him to continue because we were having this fascinating conversation about, how different Alaska is and how there are so many more stories to be told, and kind of his surprise in the fact that Alaska is kind of like that undiscovered country or that untapped resource as far as stories and ideas and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff still here, James, right?
Yeah, it really, it really did open my eyes and made me a lot more interested in learning, certainly about the history. And, history is violent and complicated and difficult. And Alaska has an amazing history.
Right.
You just think of the major events that have happened in Alaskan history, even if you just go back, just the gold rush alone. Let's just say the gold, let's just look at the gold rush alone. There's some amazing stuff that happened in the gold rush that I had no idea about. And there are books out there, and the Cole brothers obviously have written tons of them, of which I've
Right.
got all of them.
Right.
There's a lot of those, but I just think people, maybe it's the rest of the country. I think it's, maybe I'm being a little unfair. I think if you go to any state, they'll always be interested most in stories about their own state, which is
Right.
fair enough. I think that's very fair. And obviously, certain states get pushed more than others and have more of an influence than others. But there is something about Alaska, as I'm sure, everyone in Alaska, as you say, everyone who comes up to Alaska wants to, kick it off the bucket list or start over or, try and live in the wild, quote unquote, for a while. That it's I think there's only a few places in the States, at least to my mind, and, I am a stranger. I'm not American. I'm not from America. I think that really helped me with
That
this
gives you a
book.
perspective, right? I mean, it gives you an
Yeah.
a kind of an outsider's perspective. But I mean, I think you're right. I mean, Alaska is that, it's that wild, untamed land. It's the Jack London kind of feel of,
Yeah.
the wild, wild west, but only with snow and kind of thing. And
Yeah.
that's how people think about it. And a lot of times it's more of an afterthought. You had
Yeah.
an interesting point where you said, people see and think about Alaska, but they think, oh, it's just the wild, nothing bad could ever happen there. Kind of thing. But I mean, Alaska will kill you. I mean, this place is, it is harsh. It is brutal at times. It's beautiful, but it will kill you. And people just seem to put that kind of
Yeah.
thing out of their mind. And add the human element to it. And now you've got the perfect recipe for crime,
Oh, yeah. I mean, you see there's been the explosion in the last few years, the reality TV shows where people go up to Alaska and have
Sure.
to survive on their own.
Right.
So people think of that and then they watch it at TV in an hour segment and they think, well, they've managed. It can't be that bad. But it's again, look at the statistics, the size of Alaska is just enormous. And
Right.
that's another thing I think people don't really understand. And, you look at the centers of population, you've got Anchorage, which is huge, pretty huge. And there's a big drop off after that. And I think most people in most other places think, well, hang on, how can it be how can a place like that have such small centers of population? It's so enormous. Where's everything? What is everything? What's in the rest of everything? And you go, well, not a lot.
Right.
Lots of animals and lots of things to explore.
Right.
There is, and that also means that there's not a lot going on in terms of if anything goes wrong or anything turns bad, there's a
Right.
big chance that you're never going to, even just on a completely different thing, as the number of light aircraft and small planes that crash every year, that in Alaska, that was unbelievable to me. How
Right.
often that happens and how many people in Alaska have a license and how kids learn to fly and how much it's a part of life as commuting would be on a
Right.
bus to me.
Yeah.
I don't think people understand that that's possible because where else might you get that?
Right.
There are obviously other places, but that seems to be an amazing way of life.
Yeah, well, it's
The
a whole
idea,
different mentality. It's a whole different mentality. I mean, I come from
right,
gold miners. My grandfather hiked up, or my great grandfather hiked up
right,
over the Chillicothe Trail when I,
right,
so it's a whole different feel. And I always had to laugh because I'd be like, "Oh, I'm taking a trip to Fairbanks, from the Matsu, or I'm taking a trip from Fairbanks to Anchorage," and people up here is like, "Oh, okay." Down there, it's like that's a 400-mile trip, and people down there are going, "You're just going to hop in the car and drive 400 miles?" Well, yeah. I mean, the nearest town is 60, 80, 100, 200 miles away.
yeah,
It's no big deal. Down there, it's
yeah,
like, oh, I couldn't even bother to be driving 15 miles to go have dinner somewhere. That's a long trek.
right. Yeah, I mean, because everyone has there's a lot of places where people have a very comfortable life on a very general level day to day, and they're used to that and they like that, and the idea of doing something that's not that doesn't necessarily appeal. It doesn't necessarily appeal to do that, as romantic as it may sound. But I just found, yeah, just the idea of like that. I did so much research on the Alaska Highway and the building of that. That I can't believe that there aren't 500,000 books and 10
Right.
movies about that. That is extraordinary to
It's
me.
like the eighth wonder of the world. It really is.
It
I mean,
really, I cannot believe, and I talk to people about that, and they're like, "Oh, is that the road in Alaska?" And I'm like, "Well, kind of, But I mean, and people have no idea what went into it. That is amazing to me, for example.
Right.
Another
No,
thing.
I agree. I agree. I think that, Alaska, like you said, a lot of people think Alaska is an island because up on the school map, it's down here below
Yeah.
Hawaii. So they
Yeah.
have no idea. But it is kind of, again, it's the undiscovered country. It is the last frontier. And I think people, the dreams are built from that, or people just don't know. So I guess my final question here for you as we get ready to wrap up. Are you doing more Alaska stuff? Is this going to become a new obsession? What do you say?
Well, there's a couple of stories that I've got my eyes on, and I've done some inquiries and stuff, but it takes time. A lot of it's got to do with getting, documentary evidence, documentary materials, which aren't always possible. One of the ones at the moment, the stuff I'm hoping is there is literally in cold storage. That's what the guy told me. And I said, you mean cold storage? And he's like, no. I mean, it's in storage and it's not heated. So the place is literally freezing at the moment. It's winter.
Right.
And as you've said, you've had an endless winter. So I'm waiting for the breakup so that it gets to be spring, so that this guy can literally go into this storage unit and try and find this stuff for me. So that's one thing. And plus I'm trying to find other things about interesting people from Alaskan past, that we just have never heard about, but have amazing stories.
Right.
And, sure, there are amazing stories in every state, in every place in the world. But as you say, Alaska's somehow a bit more different than a lot of other places.
Well, it holds
And
a
it has that immediate thing that people go, oh, Alaska.
Yeah.
Someone did that in Alaska? Wow.
Well, it's very whimsical. It is, it inspires the idea of Alaska, the concept of it, of that last frontier kind of thing. I mean, that's a big deal. And people, I've always said, I think I've met a lot of people who said, oh, I dreamed of Alaska. I dreamed of going to Alaska. I dreamed of trying it, of being there. And, when I was a kid, I worked the tour buses, and I met 70 and 80-year-old people who said, it's been my entire dream to come here and visit Alaska. That's an amazing thing. It's an amazing place to live, but it's also an amazing place to visit. And it's cool to hear that. I love history and I love the stories. And that's why I think this is going to be fascinating. And I hope you stick with it. I hope you stick with more Alaska. And cold storage. Yeah. I mean, I had cold storage at my house. It was like 57 below, definitely cold in the storage.
That's incredibly cold. Yes. Yeah. That's incredibly cold.
That's it right there for sure. All right, James, people can find your book at thealaskanblonde.com and your other stuff there as well.
Yeah. There'll be a link to everything that's there. It is on sale in a few places in Anchorage. It's in Tidal Wave, which I found out this week, and I know that's the biggest, which is great. And it's on sale in a few places in Fairbanks. But if in doubt, you can always get it on Amazon. Plus, it's in the libraries. The libraries help me so much in Alaska, especially the Noel Ween in Fairbanks. Shout out to them. It's there as a book if you want to get it out for the library as well. Support the libraries. That's
very cool. I'm excited. I spent a lot of time as a kid at the old Noel Ween Library there.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, James Bartlett, author of the book, The Alaskan Blonde. You can find him at thealaskanblonde.com, your local bookstore, Amazon. And has anybody done the audiobook yet?
It's being done now. It's being done now.
I know a guy who's an audiobook narrator if you need one. So anyway, it's good to see you, James. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Hold the line. Folks, we're out of time. Tomorrow is Tuesday. That means Deep Dive with Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets, Brad Keithley. Also, Chris Story comes in, author of the book, The Backyard Millionaire, and more. He'll be joining us. Thanks for being part of it today. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. Be kind. Love one another. Live well. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day. All right, James, I thought I'd give you one final bite at the apple because this has been fun. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
I love this whole idea. Again, getting these stories out of Alaska, to me, it's fascinating. I'm in the middle of actually putting together a podcast that is Alaskan crime. Specifically.
Oh, excellent.
And so I'd love to have you back for an interview for that and to talk about that. But it is a fascinating piece of history, and those kind of stories. I don't know why we're fascinated with the crime, but it is a fascinating to just look into the mind of that, and it's always been part of our stories. I mean, it's always been part of this. Maybe it's parables, maybe it's a learning lesson. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's always it's the stories around. If you think about go way back, the stories that would be told around the campfire before we even had language, they would a lot of them were warnings. They were warning stories about being careful or don't go into the dark or be careful of the stranger. And I think that a lot of the true crime interest today is it's something that we can touch but without touching it. Do you know what I mean? We can get close to
Right.
it, but,
Right.
but we don't touch it. And especially we live in an age where more or less we figure that crimes are nearly always solved. And we like to live in an age, we like the security of something being solved. It doesn't make sense to us when a crime is unsolved,
Right.
especially murder, because then
Right.
you think, wait a minute, but I could be murdered.
Right.
I could be murdered. I thought, we have the technology now, and as you know very well, DNA and fingerprints and that kind of thing. That's not 100% guaranteed, because we've watched CSI for 25 years, where it does seem guaranteed more or
Right.
less.
Right.
That's not the case at all.
Right.
This case was 70 years ago. They had fingerprints. They had bloody fingerprints, lots of them. All they could do was tell you a blood group. That's all they could
Right.
do at the time.
Right.
That doesn't really
Exactly.
help. And who were the blood groups? Cecil and Diane's blood group, which is exactly what they said. He
Yeah.
was dead. He was dead in the bed, and she'd been beaten up. Of course there
Yeah.
was blood on the. So the fingerprints didn't help. They couldn't find the gun, and if they didn't find the gun, how are they really going to prove it unless someone confesses? And of course, nobody did.
Right.
She always stuck to her story that two men broke in. She
Yeah.
always stuck to that right to the end that two men had broken in.
I think it's interesting that you say, this is where that you can touch it, but it can't touch you. It's like people wanting to see wrongs righted, and that's part of that fascination. My wife always comments whenever she's watching something, some documentary or,
Yeah.
or something on true crime, where she's like, "I hate it when it's not solved at the end." And I'm like, "Yeah, because it feels." Now you feel the fear of it, right? If they catch the guy and they process,
Right.
then justice is served. But when you get a story where it's still unknown, then
Mhm.
people are like, "Ooh," it's unsettling. But it's kind of like one of those. It's like kind of like one of those thrill things. Why do we go to watch scary movies? To be scared?
Yeah.
It's human nature in a lot of ways.
And it's often the way that people who like true crime don't really read mystery books, because mystery books nearly always get solved in their fiction. They like to see the real ones get solved or not solved. And usually, a lot of mystery readers, at least that I found, are not really too interested in true crime because
Right.
they don't want to go as far as reading the stuff that really happened.
Right, it's the
You
real
know,
that's kinda me, I'm more the mystery guy, my wife is and
right,
I asked her, I said, why do you" what? She goes, "Well," she goes, "I find it fascinating to see inside the mind
right.
of somebody who's like that. Not that I wanna be that, not" she goes, "But
No,
it's
no, no.
fascinating to see inside that," and I could see some of that allure for sure, and that's why I started to put this together for my own thing, because to me, the history portion of it is interesting, and
Mm.
then to see what happened. So this is a fascinating journey for sure.
Yeah, and the good thing about historical stuff is that you usually have to dig it out. And plus also newspapers back in the day, they tended to put people's full names and addresses and other specific details. I mean, even if you think of the 30s, 40s, and 50s of the newspapers, they would show dead bodies under blankets. They would show dead bodies in the street. They would, like in
Right,
Diane Wells's case, they printed all her suicide notes. That kind of stuff doesn't happen now, but they
right,
used to do it then, and that's really good material for research when you can find that kind of thing. Because when I was researching this book, I was looking for where's the address of the house that they live? Does it still exist now? I want to go and see the outside of the house, that kind of thing. And in the old newspaper reporting, they would usually put that. You're
right,
not allowed to do that now,
right. John
and
Smith of 123 Main Street, right,
it really
exactly.
did. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, whereas, and it's the same principle as, giving full names, that we know a lot of famous killers by their full names, first, middle, and
right,
last, because, legally you have to put their full name, because if you put a shortened version of the name and someone who's got that name gets a death threat, they
right,
sue the newspaper and say, how dare you print my name?
right, no,
You printed my name. And they're like, well, it's not you. It's not you. We didn't mean you. It doesn't matter. It had my name in it. And someone came around and said, did you kill that guy? Your name was in the paper. So,
right,
you have everyone has three names.
right. All
You know,
killers have 3 names, right,
they
exactly.
have three names. And of course, they
Yeah,
don't go around introducing themselves like that, but that's how the newspaper has to put them. So, and like I say, 100 years ago or 50 years ago, we didn't solve crime so easily, which makes it interesting and makes it interesting now for us who do have the ability to go on the internet and dive into Ancestry and look in old archives and try and get an idea of what happened. Because that's all I did. I took all the available evidence. I took the official files. I spoke to people who were there. I found out there were some elements that weren't included then because it was 70 years ago that we would now consider to be important. And that was how I came up with what I thought had happened at the end. And the revelation it's not a revelation at the end. It wasn't like a UFO or some elaborate conspiracy that happened. It was a pretty standard thing. And that was why I thought this could happen today. This could happen today in the same way. That was the thing that really struck me, was that I thought if it came out that an attractive young blonde with a middle-aged rich husband, had been having an affair with a black guy today, the same thing would happen like it did in this case. The only difference would be people would be using Twitter and Instagram rather than the newspapers.
Yeah, there'd be a court of public opinion would be a whole lot different.
Exactly the same.
Yeah,
it would just be a lot quicker.
Yeah,
the same opinions, the same judgments, the same little insidious comments, and the same sort of sly racism would still happen today, and which was a pity, because you would think we would be better, but it's a human nature thing to an extent, and plus, we like crimes to be solved, and you use the Occam's razor. You think, well, what's the obvious, most likely solution of this?
Right.
And, because in this case, people thought, it was a hitman. It was a hit. It was a professional hit. It was the mafia. People told me that. And I was like, okay. And I looked into it. That was never in any of the files. And I said, okay, well, why would the mafia be in Fairbanks in the 50s? What was there for them? They were in Anchorage for sure, because that's a big city, but if it was drugs, you could just take drugs in on the airplane in those days. It was really easy to do. Why would they be pushing so far into Fairbanks, so far into the interior? What was the huge thing that they were going to get doing that, and that they were going to kill somebody for that? And plus, if you're going to kill a guy like that, this is Alaska again. Catch him while he's out driving 20 miles out of town, shoot him in his car, leave him there. You don't go into his apartment in the middle of the night and shoot him. If you're a professional, for example,
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating story. I'm looking forward to reading the book, and I'm like I said, I hope that you continue to explore the Alaskan angle on that. James Bartlett, our guest, again, author of the book, The Alaskan Blonde. You can find him at thealaskanblonde.com. James, thanks for being part of it today.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, it's a very, very fun thing. So I appreciate it. We'll talk to you again in the future.
Good, I hope so. Thank you.
All right, folks, we are out of time for today. We got more coming up tomorrow. Thanks for being part of it with us. We appreciate it. We got to go. Things to see, people to see, things to do. That would have been weird. All right, have a great day, my friends. The Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. Like and share, like and follow, subscribe, do all that stuff. We will see you tomorrow. Have a great day.
We've shed our terrestrial radio skin, and now we are slimy lizard internet people. It's the Michael Duke Show.